Hi, good afternoon. I'm Chris McCreary and I'm the founder and director of the Northern Ireland Science Festival, and you're all very welcome to this year's digital edition of the programme. We're delighted to present the beautifully crafted and inspiring book, Somebody I Used to Know, a book first of its kind written by somebody with dementia. Big thanks goes to all of today's panellists and for Queen's University for supporting the event. We hope you enjoy, and if you do, please make sure to like and subscribe to our channel, and please follow us at nisciencefestival.com for more great content. Thank you.
Hello folks, and welcome to this fantastic event at the Science Festival. We are really delighted to have you all with us today. I wish we could be in person enjoying a cup of coffee or a drink together, but we're online today. And I am absolutely delighted to have three fantastic women with us who are going to be sharing in this panel. My name's Jan Carson. I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so, but I'd love to introduce the three friends that we have with us today. So first of all, can I introduce Wendy Mitchell? Wendy was diagnosed with young onset dementia on the 31st of July 2014 at the age of 58 years young, and that's very important, young. Post-diagnosis, she was so shocked by the lack of awareness, both in the community and the clinical world, that she now spends all her time travelling around the country, raising awareness and encouraging others to speak out in order to reduce the stigma associated with dementia. She's now proud to be the author of the Sunday Times bestseller, Somebody I Used to Know, which is a fantastic read. Who would have thought that possible 5 years ago when she was first diagnosed? Wendy's one of my heroes, and I'm absolutely delighted after years of trying to track her down to have her with us today. My second guest is another fantastic writer, Anna Wharton. Anna has been a print and broadcast journalist for more than 20 years, writing for newspapers. She was formerly an executive editor at the Daily Mail. She has also ghostwritten 5 memoirs, including the Sunday Times bestseller, Somebody I Used to Know, with Wendy. Her debut novel, The Imposter, will be published in April of this year, and you can pre-order it through No Alibis Books, and pre-ordering is the love language of writers, so please do pre-order. I've read it and I can vouch for the fact that you'll be absolutely captivated. Anna and Wendy are currently writing a second book together, which is due to be published in spring of next year, and we'll hear a wee bit about that later on. My final guest today is Dr. Jane Legea, who is Senior Lecturer in English Language at Queen's Belfast, specialising in the language of literature. Her recent research examines how dementia is represented in the minds of fictional characters and how such representations can facilitate understanding of the condition in readers. Most generally, she's interested in linguistic patterns that give literary texts their styles and how they create alternative worlds and experiences for readers. And I have to confess a vested interest in Jane. She's a colleague of mine. I am the outreach officer at the minute on our AHRC-funded project looking at dementia and fiction. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have today, really exploring how we write about dementia and the experience of it. We're going to begin by having a wee chat to Wendy. So Wendy, it's lovely to have you with us. I was going to say in the studio, but you're actually in my dining room today. And I was wondering if you could begin by telling us a little bit about your experience of your diagnosis. How did you find out that you had dementia?
Well, I was working full-time in the NHS as a non-clinical team leader at the time. And I was renowned for having a brilliant memory. I never forgot the tiniest detail. But then suddenly my memory started to let me down badly. And I'd forget the names of people I'd worked with for years and the simplest of words. And when I went to the GP, she simply put it down to the normal stress and my age, the menopause. But I didn't get stressed. And I'd already been through an early menopause, so I knew it wasn't that. I'd also had a series of falls whilst out running, and then had a stroke which muddied the waters for a while. But eventually I was referred to a neurologist who guessed there was something else. And after 18 long months of memory tests and finally a SPECT scan which showed the sluggish area of my brain, young onset dementia was diagnosed. But like so many others, dementia had never entered my head, as I stupidly thought it was age-related, just like many other people. But of course, many of my playmates, as I like to call them, are in their 30s, their 40s, 50s and beyond. But a diagnosis was in fact a relief, just having a diagnosis, because it gave me something to work with, something I would never have wanted in a million years, but it gave me something, gave me a name, and I could start to plan my future.
And can I ask, it's a very small question for a big subject, but can you tell us a little bit about how your dementia diagnosis has impacted your life? Your life has changed quite a bit in the last 5 years.
Yeah, it certainly has. It's often other people that make it hard to live with dementia, because when people hear the word dementia, they skip straight to the end stages, and they forget that there's a beginning and a middle with so much life still to be lived, albeit differently and maybe with support. But the sad thing about dementia is its invisibility. We don't have it stamped across our foreheads for all to see, so people find it difficult to understand. They see me as an ordinary 65-year-old in the street and don't see the turmoil that I face every day. So we're often accused of not really having dementia, which is very insulting. And I always say, live 24 hours in my shoes and you'll change your mind. You asked how it impacted. Well, I try not to dwell on what I can no longer do. And that list is endless. I can't drive, I can't cook, and I can't tie my shoelaces, but they're all negatives. And instead I focus on what I can do. And that list is equally endless. So I've probably forgotten some of the things I can't do simply because I focus on what I can do. But I have the love and support of two wonderful daughters who enable me rather than disable me and allow me to remain living alone, which is what I want to do. That's how I live my life and how I've lived it for many years. So it's having the understanding of those around you that can make or break your transition into living with dementia, with emphasis on the living.
One of the things that I love about you, Wendy, is your sense of humour. And when you read the book, there are so many times when you find opportunities to laugh.
Yeah.
And I think your positive attitude is it's incredibly inspiring.
Thank you.
And I kind of understand why you wanted to put this in a book so that other folks could find out a little bit about your experience. But can you tell us, why did you decide to write a book? Or did someone approach you with the idea? Where did it come from?
Well, I always say, why not for anything? And lots of people have this secret urge to write a book. So many people do. I suppose I was no different. And I'd been contacted by a couple of publishers to write my own book. But I knew I couldn't write my own book because I'd write the same thing on every page. So when Anna emailed me out of the blue, the thought and the idea suddenly became a possibility. After all, I was so shocked at the lack of understanding and awareness, both from the public, but also from clinicians themselves who didn't seem to understand the concept of living with dementia. So I suppose I just wanted to put the record straight, but needed someone's help to do that.
And can I ask, I haven't thought about this before, but have you always enjoyed books? Are you a reader yourself?
I was a reader, but I find it very difficult to read books now because I can't remember what I read the minute I turn over the page. So I've rediscovered the love of children's books and short stories and, you know, the 500-word type stories. So my motto is there's always a way. So I still continue to love reading.
Absolutely. And somebody I used to know was one of my favourite reads of a few years back when I first picked it up. I first encountered Wendy at a festival where she was sharing her story and went straight out and bought this. And I think she's going to read a little section for us now, Wendy. Would you be willing to do that?
Well, it just focuses on the humour that's associated with dementia, because if you don't laugh at bad things, then you just cry. So this is the humour I see in dementia. Billy pads into the kitchen, performing a tiny dance in front of my feet. And Billy the cat, before he finds the patch of sunshine on the kitchen tiles. He flops down onto it while I scratch the back of his ears and he purrs his approval. I shake some biscuits into his bowl and he gets up and crunches on them noisily. He's only allowed a few, as Gemma has put him on a diet. She's not sure why he's put on so much weight recently, and even the vet has commented on it. I make myself a cup of tea, and as the kettle boils, I feel Billy's tail curling around my legs, and I glance at his empty bowl. Oh, Billy, have I forgotten to feed you again? As I shake more biscuits into his bowl.
Oh, poor Billy the cat. Have you got many cats in your house?
Well, I say Billy the cat is my cat. He actually lives with my daughter because he'd be a 10-ton cat if he lived with me.
I want to ask you a little bit about the book now. It has had a life of its own. You have been on TV, radio, festivals. You've been able to share your story with so many people. Can you tell me a little bit about how life has changed since you've become this celebrity author?
Oh, well, I'm not a celebrity author, but I'm just me. But it has opened up a whole new world and a whole new existence and a whole new life. Before COVID, obviously, I was busier than ever I was at work. Traveling the country and speaking at events, meeting people I would never have had access to in my previous life. And all because I have dementia. And so I call all these things the advantages of dementia, because I like to turn negative situations into positives, because that's how I cope. But it's also given me access to playmates, people going through the same thing as me, that again I would never have met in my ordinary life. And these people are now such good friends. I call them my second family. And we live at other ends of the country, yet these people mean so much to me now. And I would never have met Anna if I hadn't have had dementia. And that's very special to me too.
And can I ask, how have things changed since COVID in the last year? Have you been able to continue doing things online, or has it been very different?
It's been very, very different. Took me some I call it a roller coaster of emotions, because I did sink a lot when my routine was broken. It took me a long time, as it did very many people, to work out a new routine of what to do basically with my life. But then once I did, I was lucky. I'd used Zoom before, so I didn't have to learn how to use Zoom to keep connected to people. I belong to a group of women with dementia called Zoomettes, who have met on every Monday for years. So that we had that knowledge.
Yeah.
We weren't at a disadvantage. And it's actually opened up new opportunities, because I've spoken to students in Canada. I'm speaking to people in India next week. So, it's opened up different opportunities, and I think we have to embrace anything that comes our way at the moment.
Absolutely. I have loved that Zoom has allowed us to travel to places that we might not actually get to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although it'd be nice to see a bit of sun when you live in rainy places like we live, and like the actual travel. Wendy, I'm going to ask you one last question, and it's a big question. It's hard to reduce down into maybe a short answer, but how have people reacted to your book? What has it meant to them to see this story in print?
Well, the reaction from the public has been very humbling. The thousands of emails I've had thanking me have been just so heartwarming and made everything all worthwhile. A couple of my favourites, one from a woman saying she's no longer afraid, to another, an 85-year-old woman who lives in Hawaii, who emailed me to say she'd used some of my suggestions to adapt in her house to help her live with dementia. So, how wonderful is that reach that a book has. But as I said, I think one of the biggest benefits has been meeting playmates and not realizing, but emphasizing that when you've read one story with dementia, you have read one story, and every voice is important. Every voice is different. We have commonalities, but we also have huge differences. And it's so important that every voice is heard. And I'm just lucky that I met Anna.
Yeah. And I love that you've mentioned that. In our project, we've been looking at stories about dementia from all over the world, works in translation, poetry, plays. I've been reading so much this year, and that's exactly the point I've come up with. There's not one story. There's many, many different stories, different lives, and they all need room to be heard.
They do.
What we're going to do now is we're going to bring in one of your playmates, Anna, who is appearing to us live from her very clean kitchen. And I'm going to bring her in. Now, what I'd love to do is talk a little bit about the experience of co-writing a book together. I write books by myself, and I cannot imagine how you two managed to get along and not fall out for the whole duration of writing a book. So I'll maybe ask Anna first. Anna, could you talk a little bit about your experience of co-writing with Wendy?
Well, we certainly didn't fall out. We used to have more laughs than arguments, I would say. We didn't have any arguments. Wendy could actually be quite useful at times when I sat down with a cup of coffee to talk to her one day about whatever subject we were doing next on WhatsApp. That's how we communicated. And she would say to me, "Aren't you meant to be at your osteopathy appointment?" And I'd go, "Oh no, you're right." So she was quite useful actually to remind me of these things, ironically. But yeah, we did. Wendy doesn't use the phone, and it never occurred to us to use Zoom or anything. So we did a lot of the writing of the book on WhatsApp, strangely. I went up to visit Wendy, and so we started off like that. It was an interesting experience because a lot of people, I've ghosted quite a few books, and some of my ghostwriter friends said to me, how are you going to write a book with somebody who doesn't have a memory? How's that going to work? And I mean, that's putting it in its most crude terms, you know, because it's not as simple as that with somebody with dementia. It's not they have no memory, but it's true that how can you capture everything with somebody who maybe doesn't know something that can't remember something that happened yesterday? How are you going to write their whole life story? But it was an interesting experience. We have a dual narrative in the book. So there's a first person present, and then there's a second person past, in which Wendy told the story of her pre-dementia self.
Yeah.
And I felt it was important that a reader understood the character that Wendy was, because that also informed how she went forward after her diagnosis. And in ghostwriting, or in any writing, I really love very specific detail. And so Wendy soon learnt that this was what I really, you know, required of her. And I mean, her memory and her recall is incredible for detail. And one thing that I always say that I always loved about it is that sometimes I would ask her a question and I might have to go back to her several times over several days with the same question, and I would get a little bit more detail every time, which helped to sort of colour in the picture, if you think of kind of painting and colouring by numbers. And then sometimes Wendy would send me a picture of a post-it note the next day that she'd written in her sleep. And she would say, did this mean anything to you? And I'd say, yeah, we were talking about that yesterday. So her subconscious was bringing up detail. And so she was almost writing as she was sleeping, which I found really incredible, that the experience, and there is a lot of research that about reminiscence therapy and dementia. So and how important it is for people with dementia, and all of us really, to hang on to those autobiographical details. So I think in some ways it was quite a therapeutic experience for Wendy to write the book. I don't know if she agrees.
Well, Wendy, what was it like for you? Because at the start, I mean, Anna's a friend now, but at the start, she was somebody you maybe didn't know so well. Did it feel strange trusting her with your story?
Oh, well, at the beginning, it was important to meet her. Dementia's given me this intuitive feeling about when I instantly meet people, whether I like them or not. And I knew that I needed to meet Anna to make sure that I could trust her, because I'd be revealing my deepest thoughts to a stranger, really. And we met in London, didn't we? And I was going to a meeting or something, and we met, I think, in King's Cross. Yeah. And this figure came towards me with a big beaming smile. And I've got in my head a leopard skin coat, but I don't know if that's right or not.
I would imagine so, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you. And I immediately liked her smile and just her wacky look. She just looked lovely. And we didn't talk for very long, I don't think.
Probably.
Yeah. And I just knew instantly that it was going to work. You have to have that feeling of trust and that feeling that it will work for you to even start finding methods to make it work.
Absolutely.
Well, for me anyway.
And I hear that you're getting the dream team back together for a second book now. Can you give us any sneaky insights into what we can expect in the second volume out next year?
I'll let you go, Dad.
Well, I mean, Wendy's got a really unique voice, and so it's a combination of kind of memoir and polemic. So we need to keep Wendy's voice because that's what really connects people to her story and allows them to understand better dementia and the experience of living with it. But also she talks about her playmates, so we're bringing in some of their voices as well and just broadening out the experience, because like Wendy said and you said, it's one person's story, and everybody has a different experience of it, and different highs and different lows. So we're trying to include a little bit of research and that's relevant to Wendy's thoughts and experiences, and some voices from her pals, and of course Wendy's unique voice and memories and experiences.
I am very much looking forward to that coming next year at some stage in 2022. Wendy, you're looking forward to it as well. Spoken like a true writer, Wendy. We're going to come back to you in a wee minute or two, Wendy, but you can put your feet up and have a cup of coffee for the next wee while. I'm going to interrogate Anna for a minute or two now. Anna, you have been up until this point mostly a ghostwriter and a journalist, but you've got your debut novel coming out this year, The Imposter, which I read over Christmas and I absolutely love. This is the proof copy and it will look even more sleek and lovely in real life. Could you give us a wee brief synopsis about what The Imposter is about?
Yeah, it's about a girl called Chloe who is in her late 20s, and she works in a newspaper archiving news stories, a local newspaper, and she looks after her nan who has dementia, and she comes across a story of a missing girl who went missing 25 years before, when she was similar age to Chloe actually, and she somehow becomes quite obsessed with this story and manages to work her way into the family, hoping really that she could solve the case, or that she could bring some kind of resolution to the family, or at least that's what we believe. And then when she gets into the family, then it turns out that all may be not as it seems.
Very nicely avoided. We're definitely trying not to give away too much of the plot, because it is a twisty book and there's lots of moments that will reach out and grab you. Anna, would you do us a wee treat and give us a short reading from The Imposter?
So as I said, Chloe looks after Nan, who has dementia, and the first part of the book is that Chloe's Nan goes into a care home. So I'm just going to read an extract from that. Everyone at Park House has lost something. For some, it's an item of jewellery. One lady, 3 doors down from Nan, has been searching for months for a pearl necklace she last wore in 1947. Chloe watches her sometimes, rifling through magazines, boxes of backgammon with torn corners, or down the backs of sofas, gathering nothing but crumbs under her fingernails. The other residents are used to her. They sweep their feet out of the way or pick up their cups of tea and knitting without even breaking conversation. She mutters to herself while she's searching, telling tales of the time she wore it to no one in particular, taking herself all the way back to pre-war dance halls and their parquet floors, and never catching sight of the beads. It's an unwritten rule in the care home that everyone exists in their own time frame. Some residents sit alongside each other, separated by decades, each as real to them as the year their neighbour finds themselves occupying in the seat next door. Another thing people lose is time. That's very common. Yesterday, Chloe was making a cup of tea for Nan when a man started talking about politics. He was furious about something, gesticulating wildly, so much so that one of the nurses asked him to keep his voice down. Well, of course, it's all the Prime Minister's fault. It's all down to Edward Heath, he protested, in case he could persuade the nurse that the ex-PM himself was the reason residents were struggling to hear Countdown. Nobody corrected him. Time is mostly misplaced, which often makes the communal area one big waiting room for news, for a visit, for a loved one to return from a war that ended more than half a century before. And that is the most painful thing that people lose, family. This morning, Chloe heard one lady ask at least a dozen times where her husband was, the nursing staff gently reminding her he had died 5 months before. Every explanation wet her cheeks with fresh tears.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's a really beautiful, powerful passage. You, as I mentioned, you've done a lot of journalism work in the past. You've ghostwritten quite a few non-fiction books. Why a novel now? Why have you turned to fiction?
For my sins. Well, I guess it's a personal challenge to myself. I had written the first book that I ghosted. I'd never written at length before because, like you say, I was always a newspaper journalist or magazine journalist. So the longest I'd written was a few thousand words. And then I wrote a book about somebody who was deaf and blind. And I think that as a ghostwriter, it's kind of like assuming the role of an actor. And I suppose it's the same with fiction as well. It's such a different experience because when you're ghosting somebody, you know that the details that you're writing are real, and you might be colouring things in, but you know that they're pinned like a washing line to something that's real. And then in fiction, of course, you're building this world utterly and completely, and you're always thinking, is anyone buying this? Is anyone believing this? That book I started writing, I think, after the first book that I ghosted. So it took me 5 years because obviously I was writing other books in between. And I suppose the main reason that I wrote a novel is because these characters came to me. Nan was actually a very, very late addition. And so she came in one of the very final drafts, probably the final draft. But the characters came and they wouldn't leave. So that's all I can say. I just needed to find out what happened to these people. And
I can kind of understand the crossover there from ghosting to writing fiction, because essentially it's about voice. You're trying to capture the voice of, whether it's a fictional character or it's, someone's real life story that you're trying to bring. So I guess voice was probably very important when you came to write The Imposter.
Yeah, of course. And it took, as you know, multiple drafts, and first person, third person, first person again, third person, and also trying to inhabit the brain of somebody who is complicated, let's say.
Complicated, yeah. Chloe's Nan is such a big character and so well drawn. I mean, as I mentioned, I have read probably 60 novels now in the last few years where dementia is a component, and they vary from being wonderfully accurately written to absolutely, have you ever met anybody living with dementia? And I find Nan's character really believable. But why did you want to include this exploration of dementia in your novel?
Well, there was two reasons, really. One was a selfish reason, in that I needed somebody to help people connect to my protagonist, because she's not hugely likable, and I needed people to see a different side of her. So Nan served that purpose, because she is complicated, like I say. But like a lot of us, she has a dark side and a light side, and she is capable of caring, and some of the scenes with her and Nan, I feel, are quite tender when she's in that moment with Nan. And the second reason is that, having written ghostwritten Wendy's book, obviously this is a subject that was very close to my heart, and I felt that any inclusion of somebody with dementia in fiction normalizes it for all of us and helps us understand a little bit more. And people may not have found Wendy's book, but because they may not want to read a book about dementia, and that's something that people are afraid of as well. They think, I don't feel ready for that, and I think that's a bit depressing or something. I mean, once you read Wendy's book, it's anything but depressing. But I suppose I wanted to just make my contribution to furthering voices of people living with dementia.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up that point that, sometimes we don't need a whole narrative that's just about dementia. We just need to ensure those voices are included. Mm-hmm. So, when you're watching a TV program and there's a character who has dementia, or you're reading a book and there is one of the characters who has dementia, it feels much more of a reflection of what society's actually like. And it's really heartening to see those starting to pop up in literature and TV and film. I guess, I mean, the big elephant in the room is how much your relationship and friendship with Wendy has shaped your writing. You know, normally at this point, I would be asking a writer, did you go away and do a lot of research before you wrote that character? But you have got a live friend to do all your research on. How much did that influence the character of Nan?
Well, Wendy might not remember, but I did ask her if I could borrow some details, and I did check with her. I sent her some passages so that she could tell me if she felt that it was authentic. Yeah, so she was my inspiration, and it was really handy for me to have her there to ask.
And do you think, I mean, I haven't prepared you for this at all, but do you think there are ethics involved in writing about a story that you haven't personally experienced yourself? You know, as writers, do we have to be careful when we go into these territories writing about something like dementia? Or is it a free-for-all to write whatever you fancy kind of thing?
Well, I think that we all, as writers, we always have a responsibility to be accurate. But I don't think that we shouldn't write voices that are not our own lived experience, but I do think that they should be researched and they should be handled with care, and we should take that responsibility seriously.
Yeah, I would 100% agree, 100%. I'm going to bring Wendy back in now, and I'm going to ask her, Wendy, have you had a chance to read The Imposter, and can you give us any feedback?
Oh. Well, I was just thinking then, as Anna was saying that she'd ask me questions, how she could say anything and I wouldn't remember. So I might have read some bits, but it's like reading it new every time she sends me a passage.
That's what I was saying earlier, that Wendy's great because I can tell her the twist over and over again and she would never remember it. So it's like telling it new, telling it new every single time. It's brilliant. I love it.
I would probably say you're basically the ideal reader who responds to everything with fresh eyes.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah. I would love some readers like that who weren't jaded. We're going to bring in, Jane has been waiting very patiently up in the left-hand corner of my screen, and we're going to bring her in now. Jane has spent quite a lot of time in the last year also reading books where dementia is explored in fiction, and has, like me, run the gamut of some really great examples and some not so great examples. And I'm wondering, I'll maybe start with you, Jane. We've already started to talk about that idea of ethics, but is there any advice from your reading that you would give to fiction writers who are going to explore this topic of dementia in their work?
Okay, well, I wouldn't feel qualified to give advice to writers because my job is generally to analyze what I see written and try to interpret what that might mean. So I suppose I'm a professional reader, not a professional writer, but having read a good body of fiction about dementia in the last year or so, I would say that sometimes what I've noticed is that dementia is used more like a plot device. You know, as a society who consume fiction and cultural products, we're kind of obsessed with this idea of the unreliable narrator, and it's everywhere. It's in our soap operas with people who forget, you know, they've got amnesia about the past. It's in movie plots and structures, and it's in fiction as well. So I think sometimes dementia is used as part of that plot device to create an unreliable narrator, and that isn't always handled sensitively, say. So, but that's not to say that those texts that do use that device always use it insensitively, not at all. So I just think that in those cases, perhaps sometimes dementia is not treated with the respect and the care and the sensitivity that it might need to be. But as Anna says, research is everything. That's for me too, and for writers as well.
Anna, would you have anything to jump in there?
well, just really echoing what Jane says with regards to research. I mean, also, it's true. I mean, I admitted myself that there was a selfish reason behind me using the character of Nan, and it's absolutely true. But I think people have become slightly fatigued of that as a plot device now. So I think people need to move it on. That would be my advice to writers. But also, I would just say not to be afraid to talk to people with dementia directly, because, like I said to you, you know. I mean, some of Wendy's friends are helping us with this new book that we're doing. And also, people who have dementia are not suddenly to be stuck on some shelf. They want to talk about their lives like we all want to talk about our lives. They would like to share their experiences. I mean, it's very individual, because obviously some people are more private than others. And Wendy will tell you that she was extremely private before dementia, and dementia's changed her personality in that way. But I would say to writers not to be afraid to talk to people directly with dementia. You don't have to just read. And I'm sure Wendy would agree.
Yeah, well, if you're afraid to talk to people with dementia, you're doing the wrong storyline. You know, you're not in it for the right reason.
That's a really good point, Wendy. And we're very fortunate here in Northern Ireland. We have an amazing organisation called Dementia NI, which is an advocacy organisation. You know them well, I'm sure. And for me, over the last 5-10 years, it has been such a wonderful opportunity to get chats in and to listen to the scope of different experiences. I think this has come up in the conversation a number of times, that perhaps some of those examples of characters with dementia that don't feel real and believable is because they've been reduced down to a stereotype. And when you actually begin to talk to people who are living with dementia, you see the whole range of every kind of experience and every kind of approach to the experience. So we're very blessed to have that. Jane?
I just wanted to emphasize what you're saying about talking to people with dementia, and that's one type of research. And I think there's maybe a responsibility with fiction or with any kind of writing that if you're representing an illness of any kind, it doesn't necessarily have to be just medically accurate. The research involves talking to people who've lived it, and has to be socially accurate and with those kinds of voices heard.
Jane, I wonder, when we've got you there, if you could tell us a little bit more about the project. I've loved being on it so far for the last few months, but you are much better at articulating what we're up to than I am. So I'm going to give you the floor to tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. Well, it's been great to have you as well. So what we're doing is, if I tell you about my background, it'll let you know about my approach. So I am a linguist. I study language and how it works, and I'm particularly interested in the language of literature. And there's one concept in my field, the field is stylistics, style and language. There's one concept called mind style, and what that is, we've talked about it so far today without really putting that label on it. So you've talked about characters' voices and unique voices that you can read in narratives. And I'm sure if you are a reader, you'll be familiar with the experience of picking up a novel or a text and feeling that you have access to the way a character thinks, that the way they use language helps you see the world through their particular eyes, through the way their mind works. So that's what we call mind style, and it's present in lots of different kinds of narratives, usually fiction, and that's where we study it. And I got interested in the way dementia is represented in this kind of literary language. So how the style of the language, how patterns that are used in the language help us see the world through the eyes of a character with dementia. So being a linguist, what that involves for me to do is to gather a big group of texts, fiction about dementia, and then start to look for the patterns in the way the world is viewed through this kind of literary language. So I've spent about 6 months doing that now, 500,000 words of dementia fiction. And it's been very, very interesting. And I've also read Wendy's book and noticed how many of the tricks of language that you and Anna have used together, they're actually quite similar. You know, you were talking earlier, Anna, about the use of pronouns to represent different versions of yourself, Wendy. And I've seen that in the fiction as well. So I think with my project, I've had to draw what might be quite an artificial line between memoir based on real lived experience and fiction. So I'm studying fiction, but maybe some of the techniques and the linguistic and stylistic tools that you're using are quite similar.
And Jane, we've mentioned quite a lot about actually including people who are living with dementia in you know, how we record their narratives. How are people with dementia being included in the project?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Jan. So I've spent the first 6 months analysing this fiction, but the next part of the project is to host reading groups to see how people respond to the fiction, because what we're interested in is to see if reading this kind of literary language gives you a window into someone else's experience. Now, the reading groups are going to be hosted in the next few months, along with my colleagues. I should mention them, Gemma Kearney and Paula Devine, who are also in my university. So we're hosting reading groups, and one of those groups is going to be with people living with dementia. I'm hoping that their responses to the extracts that we read, we'll be reading, I'm glad you said 500 words earlier, Wendy, because we've been weighing up how long to make the extracts and what works for people living with dementia. And to do that, we've been in constant consultation with Dementia NI, and they said about 500 words would work well. So we'll use these extracts in reading groups with people living with dementia, and hopefully their responses to the representations there will let us know how the fictional representations tally with real lived experience. So that's the next stage of the research.
This is maybe a bit of a cruel question, Jane, because both of us have read so many books in the last few years, but are there a few highlights that have jumped out to you as books, fictional books that explore dementia, that you think, oh, these are just great reads and well worth having a look at?
Yeah. So I am focusing on contemporary fiction, so it's about the last 20, 30 years. And there's been what's been called a boom in fiction about dementia, probably in response to its prevalence in society and people being more interested in it. So there was quite a lot of text to choose from, and I've had to limit them to those that represent an interior experience of the mind. So those are the ones that I'm talking about now. And the best two, well, I wouldn't say the best, but kind of a very different range of kind of the types of books that we're looking at. I would say there's one that's a little bit older and more obscure. I think it's from the 80s, and it's translated from Dutch by Joseph Burnlef, called Out of Mind. And it's quite experimental because as the novel goes on, it's beautifully written, very tender representation of him and his wife and their love for each other. But as the novel goes on, the syntax starts to break down, so it gets quite difficult to follow the thought processes. But at the same time, he has beautiful perceptions of the world around him, and it's really lovely. So that one is quite experimental. And then at the other end of the scale, there's one by Sally Hepworth, published more recently, called The Things We Keep. And it's pop fiction. It's very readable, very enjoyable. But the best thing about it is the characters are very well developed. I think dementia is represented in a very tender, sensitive way. And it's about it's a love story that develops between two people with younger onset dementia in a care home. And that's a lovely story as well. Very, very different. So those are the kinds of things I've been reading and including in the project.
I would definitely recommend both those reads as well. And we'll give a quick plug to No Alibis. So if you fancy getting your hands on those, can we recommend our festival bookseller, No Alibis? He'll be able to track them down for you. Jane, very big question, but as we come to a close or move towards a close here, why do you think the research that you're doing is important? Sometimes it's hard to draw that line between academic research and, you know, what I will probably wrongly call the real world. But why is it important to both writers and people living with dementia what we're doing this year?
Yep. Okay. Well, I think it's important to people living with dementia because it's important to see how they are represented in our culture, in our society, how we produce and reproduce ideologies about what it might be like to live with dementia. And also, I forgot to mention earlier that we're people living with dementia are involved in reading these texts and helping us interrogate them, but also in some of the outreach work that we're doing, we are, yourself, Jan, hosting creative writing workshops with people living with dementia so that they can produce their own lived experiences in a narrative form and then have them published. So I think that's important too. Just as Wendy has done, and maybe take inspiration from some of Wendy's lovely writing. I think it's also important as well for writers, because it's important to interrogate, how do we represent others in literature? How do we represent different experiences from our own and other illnesses more generally, not just dementia? And we will be hosting creative writing workshops as part of the Dementia Fiction Festival at the end of this project, where the kind of language techniques that I've found in the fiction can then be passed on to creative writers to say, well, these are the tricks and tools that are existing out there at the moment that you can use to represent alternative ways of thinking other people's minds. But I just want to add one last point, because you mentioned people living with dementia and writers, but I think what this project also focuses on is readers and why it's important to read fiction. I think Wendy said earlier about how one of the most difficult things with living with dementia is not just the symptoms, but people's attitudes towards you and how you might be feeling in the moment. And that people need to put themselves in the shoes of living with dementia, how that might feel like. I think I'm quite passionate about the fact that it's very hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes to know how they're thinking or feeling. And fiction is one of the only ways that we can do that, reading fiction. So I think it's important for readers as well.
Absolutely, and I am all about creating more readers. The more readers we can get in the world, I think the better the world will be. Last quick question, Jane. How can people get involved if they've heard the session today and thought, I'm going to read Wendy's book, I'm going to read Anna's book, and I'd love to get involved in what you're doing? What can they do?
Yeah, great. So the website's right there, as is our Twitter handle. So you can follow us there and find out what's happening. We're recruiting for the reading groups in coming weeks and months. Well, they'll be happening February, March time. And those have limited places. So if you don't get a chance to join a reading group, then we'll also be having lots of other outreach events, culminating in a dementia fiction festival in September in Belfast. And let's hope by then we can have it in person. That would be great. Yeah,
we'd absolutely love to see you both in Belfast at some stage and to have tea and cake and a proper chat rather than this. My last question to all three of you, just to pull everything together from what has been a really eye-opening conversation today, and I hope has got lots of our audience thinking and wanting to find out a little bit more. Can I just ask each of you why you think it's so important that characters with dementia are included in our fiction and our novels and our stories that are being written? And I'll maybe begin with Anna first.
Well, it's so important because I think that there's a big emphasis generally, which is it's a myth really, that the people with dementia need to fit in better to society, or people with dementia are a problem, or they have problem behaviours or something, and it's quite the opposite. I mean, it's more to do with the fact that we as a society need to understand them better to make their experience better, and we as creators of environment need to make environments more inclusive. The only way that we can do that is to read more about the experience and how dementia affects that affects the brain and affects the lived experience. One thing that Wendy and I have been writing recently for the book is how it affects senses. I mean, taste, smell, visual, hearing, touch, all of these things. So there are small things, there are big things, of course, that are required of the government to act, but there are small things that all of us can do. But if we don't read about how dementia affects the brain, then we can't help people. And just one thing I just wanted to add before we end, that in my book, the character of Nan has quite advanced dementia. She's in a home, but I think it would be really nice for writers to write about people who are, like Wendy said, are at the beginning stages of dementia, because these people are working and they are living their lives and they're overcoming the challenges that they have every day. And so it would be nice to see some literature that includes those experiences, rather than some of the the plot devices that we use that are focused more on the end stages.
And it's definitely something that I've noticed already so far, that we need some more diversity. There are a lot of very similar characters of a similar age and background, and dare I say it, gender as well. So I'd also love to see more of a scope in the stories that are being told. Wendy, if I can just bring you in to finish, why do you think it's important to have these stories and include it in our novels and our short stories?
I just think we need to dispel the myths that when you get a diagnosis of dementia, it's the end and there's no life. And I'd like to think that by reading, writers would write about living with dementia and the life that you still have.
Thank you so much. That's a really positive way to end the session. I'm going to ask Jane the same question. Why do you think that these are important conversations to be having?
I suppose I'd just like to echo what Wendy and Anna have said, and yourself as well, about the diversity. So as we've found in a lot of the texts that we're looking at, gender and different races and nationalities, ethnicities, they're not very widely represented. So if that's a call to arms for writers, then please address this and make sure that dementia is considered as in the way that it is in the fabric of our society. It intersects with so many other things, and it is a part of life, and that's the way it should be included in literature as well then.
Folks, I'm going to wrap this up here, but can I say a huge, huge thank you to Dr. Jane Legea, to Anna Wharton and to Wendy Mitchell for keeping me company today, and also giving me an awful lot to think about, as I'm sure the rest of you listening on will be going off to think and talk about this conversation. Please go along to No Alibis and pick up the books that we've mentioned today, and please keep an eye out in 2022 for the second installment of Wendy and Anna's co-written memoir, biography, fantastic piece of non-fiction. Keep an eye out for that. I'm looking forward to it as well, and we hope to see each other again very soon. Goodbye.
Bye.